Hundreds of million-dollar locomotives left to rot in silent rail graveyards, while global demand surges, and the scrap alone could be worth millions. Why would rail giants like Union Pacific and BNSF prefer abandoning these machines, losing billions, overselling them to willing buyers? The answer is not just about economics. It is a story of tax loopholes, liability nightmares, and internal parts wars. The real reason resets everything you think you know about railway business, and the consequences are bigger than you have heard. So what makes abandonment more profitable than resale? Let's break open the ledgers and follow the money. A $3 million locomotive begins losing value the moment it is delivered. Rail companies use the Modified Accelerated Cost Recovery System called MACRS to write down that value as quickly as the IRS allows. For rolling stock like locomotives, the federal tax code sets a 7-year recovery period. In the first year, a railroad can write off 14.29% of the purchase price. By the second year, that jumps to 24.49%. After just 5 years, more than 3/4 of the value is gone on paper. What is left is called the adjusted basis, often around $500,000 after a decade or two of service. At this point, the math gets interesting. If the railroad simply abandons the locomotive, parks it in a graveyard, strips its ID tags, and records it as retired, the company claims an ordinary loss equal to the remaining book value. There is no need to find a buyer, no recapture of prior depreciation, and no taxable gain. The entire undepreciated amount becomes a deduction against income, shielding millions in revenue from federal and state taxes. For a $500,000 adjusted basis, the tax shield can reach $100,000 to $150,000, depending on the corporate tax rate and state conformity. A corporate tax advisor might walk through the journal entry, debit ordinary loss on abandonment, and credit the asset and accumulated depreciation. The loss flows straight through the income statement, improving cash flow and lowering the operating ratio, an essential metric for railroads competing on asset efficiency. Union Pacific's 2023 filings, for example, show tens of millions in abandonment losses, dwarfing the proceeds from occasional sales. BNSF's annual reports list hundreds of retired locomotives each year, with the vast majority written off rather than sold. Selling a locomotive flips the equation. Any proceeds above the adjusted basis are taxed. And even worse, the IRS claws back prior depreciation through recapture rules. The company pays ordinary income tax on the gain, shrinking the net benefit. Sales also trigger extra costs for certification, legal review, and potential liability if the unit ends up in an accident or environmental dispute down the line. In contrast, abandonment is clean, immediate, and on the ledger, remarkably profitable. This tax logic is not a loophole. It is a deliberate feature of U.S. tax law, designed to encourage capital investment and rapid asset turnover. For railroads, it means that letting a $1 million machine rust away can be more lucrative than selling it for any price the market is willing to pay. The numbers on the ledger explain why graveyards keep filling up, even as the world clamors for more locomotives. A retired locomotive doesn't just sit and gather dust. For railroads, it becomes a gold mine of spare parts. Maintenance foremen know every inch of these hulks, and they're quick to point out that a single engine can yield over $260,000 in usable components. Prime movers, traction motors, control modules, and compressors are stripped, cataloged, and fed back into the active fleet. The newest locomotives may be marvels of engineering, but older models often share enough common systems that salvaged parts can keep dozens of others running for years. The economics are straightforward. Selling a complete locomotive rarely makes sense when internal demand for parts is so high. Rebuilt power assemblies can fetch $40,000 apiece. Electronics, even when outdated, are worth tens of thousands of dollars to a shop that needs an exact replacement, and the demand never really dries up. As long as a railroad operates similar units, the value of a reliable spare outweighs any offer from an outside buyer. Meanwhile, the cost of simply holding on to these retired machines is not trivial, but it is manageable. Storing a locomotive in a graveyard runs $3,200 a year, covering minimal maintenance, insurance, and the security needed to keep vandals and copper thieves at bay. Compared to the costs of preparing a unit for sale or export, it is a bargain. The graveyard becomes a rolling warehouse, a source of insurance against unexpected breakdowns or supply chain hiccups. There is also a strategic angle. Every locomotive sold is one that could wind up in a competitor's yard, or worse, in the hands of a new short line eager to undercut rates. By stripping and mothballing their own equipment, railroads make sure that no rival gains an advantage from their cast-offs. The logic is simple. It is safer to let a locomotive rust in the desert than to see it come back as competition on the rails. For the crews tasked with keeping trains moving, these graveyards are not just scrap yards, they are lifelines. A maintenance foreman puts it plainly. When a mainline unit goes down, we need parts yesterday. Waiting for a supplier is not an option. That is why we cannibalize. It keeps the railroad running. This approach also sets up the next problem. Technology does not stand still. As computer systems evolve and emission standards tighten, the value of those parts drops off a cliff. But for now, as long as the fleet needs them, the graveyards pay for themselves many times over. Locomotives leaving active service encounter a regulatory thicket shaped by environmental law and the specter of long-term legal exposure. The Environmental Protection Agency, known as the EPA, enforces Tier 4 emission standards codified in 40 CFR Part 1033. These rules do not distinguish between a locomotive built in 1998 and one rolling off the line today. Any unit intended for recertification or resale in the United States must meet the same stringent emissions thresholds as a brand new engine. The process begins with a battery of emissions tests under Part 1065, requiring engineering analysis, detailed documentation, and submission of results to the EPA. Approval is never guaranteed. An EPA specialist says the cost of certifying a single locomotive to Tier 4 standards routinely exceeds $120,000, covering only the paperwork and testing. Retrofitting older engines with after-treatment systems, such as selective catalytic reduction and diesel particulate filters, can add hundreds of thousands more. Even after this investment, the EPA may still deny certification if the engineering data falls short of current requirements for nitrogen oxides or particulate matter. For railroads hoping to sell retired locomotives, these costs often outweigh any potential return. Yet emissions compliance is only the first obstacle. Exporting a locomotive introduces another layer of legal complexity. The Bureau of Industry and Security oversees export controls, requiring end-user screening, technical documentation, and in some cases an export license, while most locomotives are classified as EAR 99 and do not require a license for most destinations. The presence of advanced electronics or navigation systems can trigger stricter controls. An export lawyer describes the process as screening buyers and destinations, submitting documentation through the SNAP-R portal, and preparing shipping papers. Even a straightforward export can take 30 to 60 days, but any compliance issue or missing paperwork can stall the process indefinitely. The most daunting challenge, however, is liability. Once a locomotive leaves a railroad's possession, responsibility does not end. If the unit is involved in an accident or environmental incident, whether in the United States or abroad, claims can trace back to the original owner for decades. Under United States statutes like CERCLA, Liability for hazardous materials or environmental damage can persist as long as the equipment remains in use. Insurers recognize these enduring risks, and railroads may find themselves defending against lawsuits in foreign jurisdictions if exported locomotives are implicated in accidents or regulatory violations. Even robust sales contracts and indemnity clauses cannot eliminate the threat of future claims. For fleet managers and legal teams, these barriers are formidable. The upfront investment, the intricacies of export controls, and the possibility of decades-long liability combine to make selling retired locomotives a risky proposition. Regulatory and legal hurdles function as both shield and barrier, protecting companies from exposure but also locking away assets that might otherwise find new life elsewhere. Auction listings for used locomotives reveal a market flooded with supply and starved for demand. A machine that once cost $2.5 million new can struggle to fetch even $230,000 at public sale. In 2024, dozens of Dash 9s and SD70s appeared in online auctions, but most drew only a handful of bids. The winning offers often came from scrap dealers or parts brokers, not operators looking to return the locomotives to service. The numbers tell the story. Too many units chasing too few qualified buyers, and prices dropping well below the cost of preparing a locomotive for sale. One reason for this collapse is the relentless march of technology. Modern locomotives are packed with proprietary electronics, control modules, diagnostic computers, and software that tie every system together. These components are designed for a limited support window, usually about 10 years. After that, manufacturers may stop producing replacement parts or issuing software updates. A locomotive built in 2012 might look robust on the outside, but a failed control module can turn it into a 200-ton paperweight. Without factory support, even the best mechanics cannot restore these systems to working order. Listings often specify as is, no warranty, electronics unsupported, warning buyers that a single malfunction could mean tens of thousands in unrecoverable costs. A foreman in charge of locomotive electronics describes the problem with a shake of his head. We get calls from buyers asking if we can supply a replacement control board. Sometimes we have one, sometimes not. But if it is a proprietary module, and the original equipment manufacturer will not touch it, that is the end of the line. He points to a shelf lined with circuit boards, some tagged for reuse, others marked obsolete. It is not just about engines and wheels anymore. The brains go bad, and you are done. The glut is not limited to one railroad or region. Union Pacific, BNSF, and CSX all report hundreds of idle units, with storage yards stretching for miles. The secondary market is saturated, and the few buyers with the expertise and resources to operate these machines face their own hurdles. Exporting to developing countries sounds like a solution, but international buyers are wary of unsupported technology and the risk of being stranded without parts. Even at rock-bottom prices, many walk away after seeing the fine print. Screenshots from recent auctions tell the tale. A Tier 2 locomotive, originally $3 million, closed at $180,000, barely above scrap value. The listing warned of missing electronics and no guarantee of operational status. Another, a late-model AC 4400CW, failed to sell at all after bidders realized the control software was locked and the manufacturer no longer offered support. For every unit that finds a new home, dozens more linger in the graveyard, their value eroding with every passing month. This is the external blockade, a saturated market, collapsing prices, and a wave of technological obsolescence that makes even well-maintained locomotives nearly impossible to sell. The result is a landscape where abandonment is not just a financial strategy, it is often the only practical outcome for machines that have outlived their digital lifespans. A locomotive's journey doesn't end with a quiet retirement in a storage yard. Hidden beneath the faded paint and rusted steel are environmental hazards that carry a steep price tag. Every diesel-electric locomotive contains a mix of regulated materials, polychlorinated biphenyls in electrical components, asbestos in insulation and brake linings, lead-acid batteries, mercury switches, and thousands of gallons of fuel and lubricants. Federal law, especially the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, holds owners responsible for any contamination, even decades after a locomotive is parked. The cost to properly dismantle and remediate a single unit often reaches $180,000. That figure is not a guess. It is built from line items: $50,000 for polychlorinated biphenyl removal, $40,000 to drain and dispose of fuels and lubricants, $45,000 for asbestos abatement, and another $25,000 for battery and heavy metal handling. Scrapyard operators describe the process as a regulatory minefield. One operator explains that they cannot simply cut up a locomotive. Each step, removing transformers, draining fluids, and wrapping asbestos, must be documented and certified. If anything is missed, the Environmental Protection Agency can pursue enforcement against the dismantler or the railroad years later. Any misstep can trigger an enforcement action under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, making both the railroad and the dismantler jointly liable for cleanup costs. This legal risk is not theoretical. Environmental Protection Agency case files are filled with examples of abandoned rolling stock contaminating soil and groundwater, leading to multi-million-dollar settlements. For railroads, the threat of open-ended liability and six-figure remediation bills makes abandonment on private land a tempting way to sidestep the full cost of proper disposal. A fleet manager sits at the center of the decision, weighing three options for every locomotive that reaches the end of its useful life: prepare and sell, cannibalize for parts, or abandon. Each path comes with its own ledger of costs and benefits, but the numbers rarely lie. Preparing a locomotive for sale is a gamble. Certification, legal review, and export paperwork can run upwards of $300,000. Even if the unit clears every regulatory hurdle, the saturated market means it might fetch only $140,000, leaving the company deep in the red. Every sale also reopens the door to liability, with the risk of future claims hanging over the company for decades. The net result is a loss that can easily exceed $200,000 per locomotive. Cannibalizing the locomotive tells a different story. Stripping usable parts, prime movers, traction motors, control systems, yields immediate value. Internal accounting shows that parts alone can bring in $210,000 or more, all while reducing the need for expensive new components. The rest of the hulk sits in storage, but as long as the fleet needs spares, the graveyard pays its own way. This option consistently delivers a net gain, both in cash and operational resilience. Abandonment, though, is in a league of its own. By recording the locomotive as retired, the company claims a tax loss on the remaining book value, often $360,000 or more, after factoring in the tax shield. There is no need to spend on certification, no exposure to future lawsuits, and minimal ongoing costs. On paper, abandonment is the most profitable path, outpacing both sales and parts harvesting. For every locomotive, the numbers drive the choice. When the dust settles, the ledger always favors abandonment. Not because railroads want to waste assets, but because the economics leave no other rational choice. Every year, more locomotives quietly join the graveyards, casualties of a system where profits, liability, and regulation outweigh reuse. As railroads embrace disposable economics, billions in machinery become stranded assets, not second chances. Today, the choice to abandon reflects priorities that reach far beyond the tracks, a reminder that efficiency sometimes leaves value, and responsibility rusting in the sun. What would you do with a fleet left behind?